Hank lived on a quiet street in an ordinary neighborhood where each house looked like a copy of the other. Their windows were the same size, the gardens were maintained in the same way, and at nightfall, the lights on the balconies came on in perfect sync. It was the kind of place where nothing extraordinary happened, and maybe that's why Hank liked it so much. He liked knowing that each day would be more or less the same as the last. His life was organized, simple, with no unpleasant surprises, and an important part of this routine was the friendship he had built up with his neighbor, Daniel. Hank and Daniel had met a few years ago when Daniel had moved in next door. At first, they exchanged only polite nods and brief morning greetings. Daniel was a reserved, soft-spoken man, always looking away, as if lost in his own thoughts. But over time, a genuine friendship began to form between the two. At first, they just talked about the weather or the maintenance problems that an old house always brings. Gradually, however, the conversations deepened, revealing common interests. Every Thursday night, Hank would walk to Daniel's house, carrying 2 bottles of cold beer. It was a ritual that neither of them broke. On Daniel's porch, the two men would sit and talk about everything and nothing. They talked about the past, plans for the future, dreams and regrets. Hank remembered how those conversations made the week seem lighter, as if for a few hours they could escape the monotony of their routines. Daniel, for his part, always seemed more relaxed on those evenings. His normally tense face softened, and his eyes, usually full of melancholy, sparkled with interest as they discussed their favorite topics. Those Thursday evenings were like a welcome break in their lives, a time when they could be themselves, without the masks they wore to the world. On that particular Thursday, however, Hank sensed something different in the air. Perhaps it was the unusual silence that hung over the street, or the way the shadows seemed longer in the dim light of the street lamps. Something, he couldn't say what, seemed out of place. When Hank reached Daniel's porch, he found the rocking chair empty, rocking gently in the gentle breeze. The front door was ajar, something Hank had never seen before. Daniel was meticulous about security, always locking the door behind him. Hank hesitated in the doorway, feeling a slight discomfort. He called out for Daniel, but his voice was lost in the silence. He pushed open the door, revealing Daniel's living room exactly as he knew it. Everything was in its place. The old leather sofa, the bookcase full of books, the coffee table with the usual pile of magazines. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing broken or out of order, just the absence of Daniel. "Daniel?" called Hank again, taking a few cautious steps into the house. No answer. Hank felt a chill run down his spine, a feeling that he was about to discover something that would change everything. He looked around, feeling the weight of the silence, the certainty that something was wrong. As he crossed the room, a nagging feeling took hold of him, an intuition that Daniel was not just absent, but missing. And although Hank didn't know it yet, that night would be the beginning of a series of events that would lead him to question everything he believed he knew about his friend and about what was possible in this world. Hank felt a knot in his stomach as he explored Daniel's house. The feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't leave him. He called out his friend's name a few more times, louder and louder, but the only response was suffocating silence. He decided to check the rooms. Climbing the stairs, Hank noticed that everything was in perfect order. The upstairs corridor was a reflection of the living room, clean, tidy, absolutely normal. The first room Hank checked was the guest room. The bed was impeccably tidy, as if no one had used it for weeks. Nothing out of place. Next up was Daniel's room. When he opened the door, he found everything as he expected. The messy bed suggested that Daniel had slept there recently. His clothes were thrown on a chair in the corner, and the desk by the window was covered in papers and notes. Hank approached the desk, looking through the papers, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Bills, correspondence, an open notebook with random notes. It was then that Hank noticed something on top of the dresser. A small wooden box with intricate carvings on the lid, something he had never seen in Daniel's house before. He approached, hesitantly, and opened the box. Inside, he found a series of old photos, many of them showing desert landscapes and a starry night sky. At the bottom of the box, there was an old-looking key and a folded piece of paper. Hank took the paper and opened it, revealing a hand-drawn map with a dot marked in a place he didn't recognize. Before he could think any more about it, Hank heard a noise coming from outside. He quickly closed the box and ran to the window. He looked out but saw no one, just the empty street, bathed in the dim light of the street lamps. He felt a presence, as if he were being watched. He turned around quickly, his heart beating fast, but the room was empty except for him. Going back down to the living room, Hank tried to find some clue as to Daniel's whereabouts. He called his friend's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Then he called a few neighbors, asking if anyone had seen Daniel, but no one knew anything. It was as if he had simply evaporated. Not knowing what else to do, Hank decided it was best to go home and wait. Perhaps Daniel had gone out for some reason and would be back soon. Even so, the restlessness didn't leave Hank alone. He couldn't shake the image of the door ajar and the strange sensation he had felt when he entered the house. Back in his own house, Hank sat in the living room armchair, looking out of the window in the direction of Daniel's house. The lights were still off and everything was quiet. He tried to watch TV to distract his mind, but his attention kept returning to the events of that night. When he finally went to bed, Hank knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. His thoughts were fixed on Daniel, the mysterious box, and the map. It all seemed like a puzzle that he didn't know how to begin to solve. Lying there in the dark, Hank felt that uncomfortable sensation of being watched again. And for the first time in his life, he felt uncomfortable in his own home. As he stared at the ceiling, an idea began to form in his mind. Perhaps the map was a clue. Maybe there was something in that marked place that could explain Daniel's disappearance. Hank decided that if his friend didn't show up by the next morning, he would investigate for himself. With this resolution in mind, he finally closed his eyes, trying to calm his mind enough to rest. The last thing he thought before falling asleep was that somehow everything had changed. That Thursday, that had started out as just any other day, now seemed like the beginning of something much bigger and darker than he had ever imagined. The next morning, Hank woke up to sunlight streaming through the curtains. He got up quickly, his mind still caught up in the events of the night before. He got dressed and went to the window to check on Daniel's house, but everything seemed as quiet as ever. The street was silent, with only a few birds singing, and a neighbor from 2 blocks away mowing his lawn. It was an ordinary day in the neighborhood, but Hank knew that for him nothing would be ordinary until he met Daniel. After a quick breakfast, Hank returned to his friend's house. The door was still ajar, just as he had left it. He went inside, calling out for Daniel one last time, but without much hope of an answer. The house was silent, and the feeling of emptiness was almost palpable. Hank headed straight for Daniel's room, determined to investigate further the box he had found the day before. He found the box exactly where he had left it. He sat down on the edge of the bed, opened it, and took out the map once more. He examined it more closely this time, trying to recognize any landmarks or reference points. The map seemed to represent a rural area, with a meandering path leading to a point marked with an X. With no legend or clear indication of what the map represented, Hank realized that he would have to trust his instincts. Hank put the map in his pocket and decided to look around the room one more time. Rummaging through the desk, he found a notebook that appeared to be Daniel's diary. The pages were full of disorganized scribbles, unfinished sentences, and strange drawings. Some pages contained diagrams of complex geometric figures and symbols that Hank couldn't understand. On several pages, there were notes about strange noises and sightings in the sky, things that Daniel had never mentioned during their conversations. Something in particular caught Hank's eye, a note on one of the last pages of the notebook. In it, Daniel had written, I found a strange device in the backyard. There's something engraved on it. It looks alien. I need to find out more." Hank frowned and stood up quickly. The backyard. It was a place he hadn't checked yet. Leaving through the back door, Hank entered Daniel's yard, which was surrounded by a high fence, providing a sense of isolation. He started looking around for anything out of the ordinary, pacing back and forth, until something glinted in the sun, catching his eye. In the far corner of the yard, half covered by leaves, there was a small metal object. Hank knelt down and picked it up. It was a metal cylinder, smooth and cold to the touch, with a series of symbols engraved on its surface. Hank's heart beat faster as he turned the cylinder in his hands, trying to understand what it was. It didn't look like an ordinary tool or piece of machinery. In fact, it didn't look like anything Hank had ever seen before. The symbols made no sense, but there was something undeniably strange and unusual about the object. Hank went back into the house, taking the cylinder with him. He placed it on the kitchen table and tried to think of what to do. The object and the map suggested that Daniel might be involved in something much bigger than he had imagined. Perhaps the notes in the notebook were not delusions, but clues to a truth that Daniel was discovering. As Hank pondered his next actions, his cell phone rang, breaking the silence. He picked up the phone and saw the unknown number on the screen. He answered hesitantly, not knowing what to expect. "Hello?" Hank said, trying to sound confident. "You're Hank, Daniel's friend, right?" The voice on the other end was calm, but there was a tone of urgency. "We need to talk about Daniel and what he was investigating. Meet me at the coffee shop downtown in an hour. He'll explain everything." Before Hank could answer, the call was disconnected. He stood there for a moment, processing what he had just heard. Whoever it was, they seemed to know what had happened to Daniel, or at least they knew more than he did. Hank looked at the cylinder on the table and the map in his pocket. Everything was starting to fall into place, and he was determined to follow any lead that would lead him to Daniel. With one last look at Daniel's house, Hank left, feeling that this was just the first of many clues he would need to follow. And although he didn't know exactly what he was getting into, one thing was clear: he wouldn't turn back until he found answers. Hank arrived at the coffee shop in the city center a little before the agreed time. The place was relatively empty for that time of day, just a few customers scattered around the tables. The soft background music and the smell of fresh coffee offered a welcoming atmosphere, but Hank was far from comfortable. He chose a table in the corner from where he could watch the entrance and sat down. The mystery surrounding Daniel's disappearance, the map, the metal cylinder, and now this enigmatic connection were making everything more confusing. As he waited, Hank wondered who the person on the other end of the line could be. An acquaintance of Daniel's? A work colleague? Or perhaps someone who knew more about what was going on? Hank was lost in thought when the door to the cafeteria opened and a woman rushed in. She looked around as if searching for someone, and her eyes stopped on Hank. She headed straight for his table. "You must be Hank," she said, sitting down before he could reply. She was a woman in her 30s, with brown hair tied back in a ponytail and a determined look. "My name is Sarah. I know Daniel." Hank nodded, still surprised by the sudden entrance. "Do you know where he is?" he asked bluntly. Sarah sighed, looking around as if checking to see if anyone was paying attention to them. "I don't know exactly where he is," she admitted, "but I know he's in danger. Daniel was investigating something big, and he was close to discovering the truth. Before he disappeared, he told me that he was afraid, that he thought he was being followed." "Followed by whom?" Hank asked, frowning. "I don't know exactly, but Daniel believed that there were people, or maybe something, trying to stop him from continuing his research." Sarah hesitated, as if weighing up each word. "He was obsessed with the idea that we weren't alone, that there was an alien presence among us." Hank was silent for a moment, trying to process what Sarah was saying. He had always known that Daniel had an interest in conspiracy theories, but he had never imagined that he was actually investigating something like this. Are you saying that he believed in aliens? That he was being followed by aliens? Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. I know it sounds crazy. I thought so too at first. But after seeing what he discovered, the evidence, I can no longer rule out the possibility. He mentioned a strange object he found in his backyard, something with alien symbols on it. I think that's why he disappeared. Hank felt a chill run down his spine. The metal cylinder. It was still in his backpack, which he had brought with him. Without saying a word, Hank picked it up and put it on the table. Sarah's eyes widened, clearly recognizing the object. That's it, she exclaimed in an urgent whisper. That's what he was talking about. Daniel thought it was some kind of communication device, or maybe a tracker. He said he couldn't stop thinking about it, that he needed to find out what it meant. What about this map? Hank asked, pulling the folded map from his pocket and holding it out to Sarah. I found this along with the cylinder. Sarah took the map and studied it for a moment. I don't know. I don't recognize this place. But Daniel mentioned a specific place. A place where he believed something important was happening, something that explained everything. Maybe this map leads there. Hank shook his head, trying to connect the pieces of the puzzle. So, what do we do now? If he really is in danger, we need to find him. We need to find out what's going on. Sarah agreed. We need to go to that location marked on the map. It's our only lead. But we have to be careful. If Daniel was right and someone is trying to cover it up, then we'll be in danger too. Hank felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Everything was happening so fast. Just 2 days earlier, he had been chatting with Daniel on the balcony like any other Thursday. Now, he was involved in something he could barely comprehend, something that seemed straight out of a science fiction movie. But one thing was clear. He couldn't go back. Daniel needed him, and Hank would do everything in his power to find his friend and solve this mystery. With this resolution in mind, Hank and Sarah left the coffee shop, leaving the coffee cups untouched on the table. Hank held the cylinder in one hand and the map in the other, feeling the weight of the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. They were about to embark on a journey into the unknown, and nothing would ever be the same. Hank and Sarah walked together in silence down the busy street, each immersed in their own thoughts. The map, folded carefully in Hank's pocket, was his only clue as to where Daniel might have gone. The idea of following a hand-drawn map in search of an unknown and possibly dangerous location was both exciting and frightening for Hank. Sarah seemed as determined as he was, her quick, steady steps revealing the urgency she felt. Before setting off on their search, they decided to stop off at Hank's house to get ready. As soon as they entered, Hank went straight to the kitchen, where he opened a drawer and took out a small flashlight and a hunting knife that he kept for emergencies. He didn't know what to expect, but he didn't want to be completely unarmed. Sarah watched in silence, her eyes scanning the place, as if waiting for something to jump out of the shadows. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she finally asked. There was a tone of concern in her voice. Hank nodded. "Daniel is my best friend. If he's in trouble, I need to do something. Besides, I can't just ignore what I've seen and heard. I need to understand what's going on." Sarah smiled slightly. "Then let's go. I'll drive." They left Hank's house and got into Sarah's car, a discreet sedan that blended easily into the city traffic. Hank unfolded the map on his lap, trying to identify the best route to get to the marked location. The road seemed to lead to a forested area on the outskirts of the city, a place Hank had never visited. During the drive, the tension in the car was palpable. Hank and Sarah exchanged few words, focused on the road and what lay ahead. As they left the city behind and entered more rural areas, the landscape transformed into fields and hills, interspersed with stretches of dense forest. Sarah's GPS didn't recognize the destination, so they relied entirely on the map, following back roads and little-used trails. Do you know if Daniel had any contact with other people about what he was investigating? Hank asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Sarah shook her head. Not that I know of. He was quite secretive about it. I think deep down he knew it sounded crazy. But the more he investigated, the more obsessed he became. It was as if he had found something that couldn't be ignored, something that consumed him. The last few weeks before he disappeared, Daniel was different, more paranoid. Hank pondered this as the car sped down a dirt road, kicking up dust in the air. He remembered recent conversations with Daniel, the way he would abruptly change the subject or seem distracted. Now it made sense. Daniel was dealing with something much bigger than Hank could imagine, and he didn't know how to ask for help. After almost an hour of driving, they reached a clearing in the forest. Sarah parked the car, and the two of them got out, stretching their legs. The air there was fresh, but it carried a weight that Hank couldn't explain. He picked up the map again, checking the location. The marked X was only a few meters from where they were now. "It's this way," said Hank, pointing to a narrow path that led into the dense woods. They started walking, the sound of dry leaves and branches breaking under their feet, filling the silence. The trail was little used, almost invisible at some points, but Hank kept his focus, guided by the map. After a few minutes of walking, they came to a small clearing. In the center of it, there was a circle of carefully arranged stones, like an ancient altar. In the middle of the stones, something metallic reflected the sunlight that made it through the treetops. Hank approached cautiously, followed by Sarah. When he bent down to examine the object, he felt a shiver run down his spine. It was another metal cylinder, similar to the one he had found in Daniel's house, but larger and more intricate. Around the cylinder, symbols were carved into the stones, like an ancient language that Hank couldn't understand. "This is the place," Sarah murmured, her eyes fixed on the cylinder. Daniel was right. He found something. Some kind of meeting point, perhaps. Hank looked at Sarah and then at the cylinder again. Something about the place seemed different, as if they had crossed into a dimension where the rules of reality were altered. The air around them seemed to vibrate slightly, and an unearthly silence enveloped the clearing. "We need to find out what this means," said Hank decisively. "Maybe there's a connection between this and what happened to Daniel, but we can't do it alone. We need help to understand what we found here." Sarah agreed, but there was obvious concern on her face. "You're right, but we need to be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with, and if Daniel was in danger because of this, we might be too." As Hank and Sarah walked away from the clearing, the feeling of being watched followed them. They knew that they were only just beginning to unravel a much bigger mystery, and that each answer would lead them to even more disturbing questions. Back in the car, Hank and Sarah decided that the next step would be to take their findings to someone who could help them understand what they had found. The larger metal cylinder still in the clearing seemed to emit a presence that Hank couldn't explain, as if the object were more than just metal. When Hank and Sarah finally left the site, it was already starting to get dark, and the shadows of the trees seemed to lengthen in a strange way, as if they were alive. On the way back, Hank kept thinking about the clearing, the symbols engraved on the stones, the cylinder, the strange feeling in the air. It all seemed so surreal, as if he were taking part in one of those stories he used to watch in documentaries about unsolved mysteries. Sarah drove in silence, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, but Hank knew that she was just as disturbed by what they had found. "Who do you think we should show this to?" Hank broke the silence, still trying to process everything. Sarah thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe someone at the university. I know an anthropology professor who could help us decipher these symbols. He has an interest in ancient cultures and might have a better idea of what it means." Hank nodded. It sounded like a good plan. Suddenly, he felt his jacket pocket vibrate. It was his cell phone, receiving a message. He picked it up and read the notification. A message from an unknown number. "You're closer than you think. Watch out." Hank frowned and showed the message to Sarah. She cast a quick glance at her cell phone and refocused on the road. "Someone's trying to scare us," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "But that just means we're on the right track. We need to keep going." Hank put his cell phone back in his pocket, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Who was sending those messages, and how did they know about his movements? He looked out of the window, watching the trees go by quickly, and a feeling of déjà vu came over him, as if he were being taken to a destination he already knew, even though he had never been there before. Suddenly, Sarah slowed down and stopped the car on the roadside. "Look," she said, pointing to the sky. Hank followed Sarah's gaze and his heart almost stopped. There were lights in the sky. They weren't stars or planes, but a set of luminous points moving in an organized way, forming a complex pattern. There were 3 lights, each of a different color, red, blue, and green. They moved in perfect circles, as if they were drawing something in the sky. Hank was speechless, watching the spectacle, unable to look away. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" asked Sarah, her voice a whisper of amazement. Hank shook his head slowly. "Never. But I think Daniel has." Sarah turned to him in surprise. "What do you mean?" Hank struggled to remember. Daniel mentioned a few days before he disappeared that he had seen strange lights in the sky. I thought he was just imagining things, but he was telling the truth. The lights in the sky continued their movement for a few more minutes and then, without warning, suddenly disappeared, leaving the sky dark and empty again. Hank felt a wave of frustration and fear. They were closer to some revelation, and yet so far from the truth. Sarah started the car again and continued driving. "We need to talk to this professor as soon as possible," she said, with a tone of urgency in her voice. "Those lights, they're a sign. Something is happening, and we need to understand what it is before it's too late." As they drove back to the city, Hank couldn't shake the thought that they were dealing with something much bigger than they could have imagined. The message on his cell phone, the lights in the sky, the constant feeling of being watched. Everything pointed to an invisible presence, manipulating events in a way that Hank could barely comprehend. Finally, they arrived at Hank's house. He invited Sarah in, and they both sat in the living room, still processing what they had seen. Hank picked up the smaller metal cylinder and placed it on the coffee table, next to the map. "We have to understand what these things mean," said Hank, looking at Sarah. "Daniel knew, and now he's missing. If we want to find him, we need to follow the clues he left us." Sarah nodded. "Tomorrow, we'll look for the professor. He can help us connect the dots. Tonight, rest. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next." Hank agreed, but knew it would be difficult to sleep. His mind was racing, full of images of lights in the sky and mysterious symbols. He went up to his room, but not before taking one last look out of the window, half expecting to see those lights again. The sky was dark, calm and empty, but the feeling of unease remained. The next morning arrived with an air of expectation and tension. Hank had slept badly, with restless dreams involving flashing lights and meaningless whispers. He woke up early, feeling even more determined to find out what had happened to Daniel. As he hurriedly sipped his coffee, his thoughts returned to the clearing in the forest and the mysterious lights in the sky. Something was connecting, and he needed to understand how. Sarah arrived at Hank's house shortly after dawn, carrying a backpack and a serious countenance. She had called the anthropology professor at the university and set up a meeting for later that morning. The professor's name was Dr. Alan Morales, a specialist in ancient cultures and esoteric symbols. Sarah believed he might have the answers they needed. "Dr. Morales is a bit eccentric, but he knows a lot about these things," said Sarah as they drove to the university. "If anyone can help us decipher these symbols and understand what Daniel found, it's him." Hank nodded, looking out of the car window. The city was still waking up, and the movement in the streets was quiet. Despite the calm around him, he felt a swirl inside him, a mixture of anxiety and expectation. What would the professor say? Would they finally have a concrete clue about Daniel's disappearance? They reached the campus and headed for the social sciences building, where Dr. Morales had his office. The corridor was empty, except for a few students hurrying past, carrying books and laptops. Sarah knocked on the door of the professor's office, and a deep voice answered from inside. "Come in." Opening the door, Hank saw a middle-aged man with grey hair and a neatly trimmed beard sitting behind a desk covered in papers and books. Professor Morales seemed to be concentrating on an old manuscript, but he looked up when he saw Hank and Sarah and gave a slight smile. "Sarah, my dear," he said, rising to greet her. "And you must be Hank. Sarah told me a bit about your situation. It seems you have something interesting to show me." Hank nodded, and without wasting any time, took the map and the metal cylinder out of his backpack. He carefully placed them on the professor's desk, who immediately leaned over to examine the items with obvious curiosity. Dr. Morales picked up the cylinder first, turning it over in his hands, observing the details with attentive eyes. "This object is very peculiar," he murmured. "It looks ancient, but at the same time it has a modern construction. And those symbols, yes, I've seen something similar before." Hank and Sarah exchanged looks of surprise and relief. Finally, it seemed they were on the right track. Dr. Morales continued, now turning his attention to the map. "You mentioned a stone circle, didn't you?" asked the professor, without taking his eyes off the map. "Yes," confirmed Hank. "We found a larger cylinder there, with more symbols engraved around it." Dr. Morales nodded slowly, as if a theory was forming in his mind. These stone circles are often associated with ancient rituals, possibly of worship or communication with forces beyond common understanding. These symbols, he pointed to the cylinder, seem to be a coded language, perhaps an attempt to record or a kind of call. "Call?" Sarah asked, confused. "Are you saying that this could be some kind of communication device?" Dr. Morales looked at her, pondering. "It's possible. Ancient cultures often believed in higher beings, visitors from other worlds. They used objects like this to try to establish contact. I'm not saying that this cylinder is alien, but the symbolism suggests an attempt to connect with something beyond our comprehension." Hank felt a shiver run down his spine. So Daniel was trying to communicate with aliens? Dr. Morales raised an eyebrow. Or maybe he discovered something that suggested aliens were trying to communicate with us. In any case, this is speculation at the moment. We need more information. I know a colleague who is a specialist in ancient artifacts. He has equipment that can analyze the composition of this cylinder and perhaps give us a better idea of its origin and purpose. He'll get in touch with him. Hank and Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They finally had a plan, a direction to follow. However, each answer seemed to open up even more questions. What had Daniel really found? And why did someone or something seem so interested in his disappearance? As they left the professor's office, Hank realized that although they had found an ally in Dr. Morales, they were getting deeper and deeper into a mystery that defied comprehension. He looked at Sarah and saw in her eyes the same determination he felt. They would go all the way, no matter what they found. After leaving the university campus, Hank and Sarah decided they needed some time to process everything they had heard. Dr. Morales' words resounded in their minds like a persistent echo. He had mentioned the possibility of the cylinders being communication devices, perhaps used to try to contact beings beyond our world. It was such a fantastic idea that Hank found it hard to accept, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore the strange events of the last few days. "We have to be careful," said Sarah as they walked through the parking lot. "Whatever we're facing, we're not alone in this. Someone sent those messages to you. Someone knows what we're doing." Hank nodded, remembering the cryptic message he had received. The idea that they were being watched, perhaps by someone or something they didn't understand, made him uncomfortable. They decided to spend the afternoon in a local coffee shop, a discreet place where they could talk without being interrupted. Sitting at a table at the back, Hank opened his laptop, determined to do more research on the symbols they had found. If Dr. Morales was right, these symbols could be the key to unlocking the whole mystery. While Hank browsed through various archaeology and history websites, Sarah was absorbed in her own thoughts. The mention of communication with extraterrestrials reminded her of stories she had heard in her childhood, of UFO sightings and alien abductions. She had always considered these reports to be exaggerations, the fruit of fertile imaginations. But now, she wasn't so sure. "Look at this," Hank said suddenly, interrupting Sarah's thoughts. He turned his laptop towards her, showing her an image from an academic website. It was a photograph of an ancient metal cylinder covered in symbols that resembled the ones they had found in the forest. "This is a piece that was found in the 1970s at an archaeological site in Central America," Hank explained. "Archaeologists have never been able to pinpoint its exact origin or purpose, but some believe it to be related to practices of worship or communication with gods." "Gods or aliens," Sarah murmured, absorbing the information. Hank nodded. "It looks like Daniel was on the right track. These symbols have some kind of connection. Maybe they're part of a bigger puzzle, something he was trying to solve." Suddenly, Hank's cell phone vibrated on the table. He looked at the screen and saw that he had received another message, again from an unknown number. "Let it go. You don't know what you're dealing with." Hank showed the message to Sarah, who frowned. "This is getting serious. Whoever it is, they don't want us to find out the truth." "Or maybe they're trying to protect us," Hank suggested, although he wasn't convinced of that himself. While they were pondering the message, a man entered the cafeteria. He was tall, wearing an impeccable black suit and sunglasses, despite being in a closed environment. His eyes scanned the place briefly before he walked up to the counter to order a coffee. Hank couldn't help but notice the air of authority the man exuded, like someone used to being obeyed. Sarah followed Hank's gaze and whispered, "Is he watching us?" "Maybe," Hank replied, "or maybe we're getting paranoid." Even so, they couldn't ignore the feeling that they were being monitored. The man picked up his coffee and sat down at a table not far from theirs, maintaining a neutral expression, but Hank felt that his movements were being discreetly observed. "We need to be more careful," Hank whispered to Sarah. "I think we should get out of here." Agreeing, Sarah closed Hank's laptop and they both stood up quietly, trying not to attract the attention of the man in the suit. They left the cafe and walked quickly down the street, turning the first corner they came to. Hank looked back and saw the man coming out of the cafe, looking in his direction. Hank's heart beat faster, but he tried to remain calm. "Where are we going?" asked Sarah, slightly out of breath. "Home. We need to think about what to do next. We have to find out who's watching us and why," replied Hank. As they walked back to Hank's house, they both knew that they had crossed an invisible line. What had initially seemed like an investigation into the disappearance of a friend had now become something much more dangerous. They weren't just looking for answers. They were in the middle of a game of hide and seek with forces they might not fully understand. Back at Hank's house, they both sat at the kitchen table, trying to catch their breath after their tense escape from the coffee shop. The presence of the man in the suit had added a new layer of danger to their already uneasy situation. "We need to understand what's going on before it's too late," said Sarah, trying to organize her thoughts. "Whatever we're facing always seems to be one step ahead of us." Hank agreed and picked up the smaller cylinder, which was still on the table. "Let's do what Dr. Morales suggested. We need an expert to analyze this cylinder. Maybe we can find something we haven't noticed yet." Sarah picked up her cell phone and did a quick search. "He'll get in touch with Professor Morales' colleague. He should have the right equipment to analyze the cylinder." While Sarah made the call, Hank decided to investigate further. He had noticed that, in all the information they had found so far, none of the reports mentioned anything as specific as the symbols and the cylinders. He needed to better understand the origin of the objects and why they were involved in something so dark and mysterious. Hours later, Sarah ended the call and informed Hank that Dr. Morales' colleague, an expert in ancient artifacts named Dr. Richard Allen, had agreed to analyze the cylinder. They had arranged a meeting for the following morning. "It looks like we have a new lead," said Sarah, relieved. "And now we need to get some rest. We don't know what the future holds, but at least we're making progress." "That's true," Hank replied. "But there's still something that bothers me. Why was that man in the suit watching us? And who is sending those threatening messages?" Sarah sighed. "These questions still don't have answers. We need to focus on getting more information and finding out what Daniel knew. Only then will we be able to understand the full picture." As they talked, an idea began to form in Hank's mind. "I was thinking, what if the cylinder had some form of tracking? If Daniel was trying to communicate with something or someone, there might be a way of locating what he was looking for." "That might be a good idea," Sarah said, turning on a light. "We need to check if the cylinder has any kind of technology built into it. That would give us a clue as to what's going on." Determined to explore this possibility, Hank and Sarah began to examine the cylinder more closely. Using a magnifying glass, they studied the symbols and structure of the object. Despite their attempts, nothing seemed to indicate a tracker or advanced technology. However, Hank noticed something strange, a small mark on the base of the cylinder that looked like some kind of code. "Look at that," Hank said, pointing at the mark. "That looks like some kind of number or code." Sarah examined the mark and made a note. "It could be a starting point. Maybe we can find out what it means when we talk to Dr. Allen." As they continued their investigations, the day wore on and night came quickly. They were both tired, but their determination to solve the mystery kept them on their toes. Sarah prepared something simple for dinner, and during the meal, they discussed the strategy for the meeting with Dr. Allen. After dinner, Hank decided to check his cell phone one last time before going to sleep. He reviewed his messages and came across yet another notification from the unknown number. This time the message read, "You're digging too deep. This won't end well for you." Hank showed the message to Sarah, who looked at him with concern. "We need to be even more careful. Someone is really trying to intimidate us." "Yes, but that just gives us more motivation to keep going. We're close to discovering something important," Hank replied, trying to maintain his confidence. Finally, after making sure all their notes and findings were organized, Hank and Sarah went to bed. Sleep was restless for both of them, with nightmares that mixed ancient symbols, strange lights, and the constant feeling of being watched. The next morning, the sun rose with the promise of answers, and they both prepared to meet Dr. Allen. They knew that the meeting could bring new revelations, but they were also aware that the danger was becoming more and more real. As they left the house, Hank looked at the cylinder and the maps spread out on the table. The journey to understand Daniel's disappearance and what lay behind the cylinders was just beginning, and they were more determined than ever to get to the bottom of the mystery, despite the risks and threats. The next morning, Hank and Sarah were ready to meet Dr. Richard Allen. Both felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation as they drove to the specialist's analysis laboratory. Dr. Allen was known for his ability to decipher ancient artifacts and was about to play a crucial role in solving the mystery. The laboratory was located in a modern academic building, and when they arrived, they were greeted by Dr. Allen, a man of medium height with dark hair and a concentrated expression. He greeted them with a firm handshake and led them to his work area, where various pieces of analytical equipment were arranged on tables and benches. "Good morning, Hank and Sarah. Let's see what we have here," said Dr. Allen, carefully picking up the cylinder and examining it under a bright light. "I'm going to use some equipment to analyze the composition of the material and check for any signs of hidden technology." Hank and Sarah watched as Dr. Allen worked with precision, operating a spectrometer and other devices. The process took some time, and the tension was palpable. Dr. Allen made notes and observations, but remained silent, leaving Hank and Sarah anxious for any new information. Finally, Dr. Allen stepped away from the equipment and turned to them with a thoughtful look. "The analysis revealed some interesting things," he began. First, the cylinder is made of a rare metal alloy, which is not common in ancient artifacts. It seems to be a mixture of metals that don't match any known historical records. "What about the symbols?" Sarah asked, trying to remain calm. "The pattern of the symbols is what really intrigued me," replied Dr. Allen. "They're not a known language, but they bear similarities to certain symbols used in ancient rituals. There's a pattern of repetition that suggests an attempt at coding or communication. There seems to be a deliberate intention to hide a message or instruction." "That makes sense," said Hank, remembering the threatening messages they had received. "And is there any chance that these symbols could be related to some advanced technology?" Dr. Allen hesitated for a moment. "Theoretically, yes. Although the cylinder itself has no visible technology, the coding could suggest a form of communication that goes beyond common understanding. There could be a connection to something more advanced, but we'd need more data to confirm it." "So what do we do now?" Sarah asked. "I would recommend continuing the investigation at the points where you found the cylinder and the map," said Dr. Allen. "If there is some kind of hidden technology or message, there may be more clues at the place of origin. In addition, I can try to decipher more of the symbols and look for similar patterns in other ancient sources. I'll dedicate myself to that, but it's essential that you act quickly." With the information in hand, Hank and Sarah left the lab with a new sense of urgency. They had a way to go, and the next step would be to revisit the clearing in the forest to look for more clues. When they reached the clearing, the sun was high in the sky, and the area looked peaceful, almost desolate. But the calm didn't fool Hank. He knew that the real complexity lay hidden beneath the surface. They began to search the site again, looking for any signs that might have gone unnoticed before. As they searched the area, Hank found something that looked as if it had been moved recently, a small stone with markings similar to the symbols on the cylinder. He picked it up and showed it to Sarah. "This could be a clue," he said, examining the stone. "If these markings are here, it could mean that something important is hidden nearby." Sarah nodded and began to look around. "Let's be meticulous. We can't let any details slip." Working together, they spent hours examining every inch of the clearing. Time was running out, and the sky was beginning to darken when Hank noticed something unusual. A small opening at the base of one of the oldest trees in the clearing. The opening was covered in leaves and dirt, as if it had been hidden intentionally. "Sarah, come here!" called Hank. Sarah approached, and they both began to clear the opening. As they dug, they discovered a small metal box hidden in the hollow of the tree. The box looked old and corroded, but it was intact. "This must be important," said Hank, his heart racing. "Let's open it and see what's inside." Carefully, they opened the box, revealing a series of ancient documents and objects, including more metal cylinders, similar to the ones they had already found, but in different sizes and shapes. There was also a diary with worn pages written in old handwriting. Sarah picked up the diary and began to leaf through it. "It looks like this belongs to someone who has been deeply involved in studying these symbols and artifacts. This could give us answers." As they examined the contents of the box and the diary, the feeling that they were getting closer to the truth intensified. Each new item revealed more about the complexity of the mystery they were involved in. As night fell over the clearing, Hank and Sarah knew they were facing a crucial revelation. Whatever Daniel had found and what the cylinders really represented were beginning to reveal themselves, but the journey was far from over. As night fell, Hank and Sarah sat in the clearing, illuminated only by the lights of their flashlights. The metal box they had found lay open between them, and the diary, which seemed to be the centerpiece of the discovery, was prominently displayed. Sarah carefully opened the diary, whose pages were yellowed and fragile, and began to read quietly. The handwriting was old, but still legible. Hank leaned over to read along, both of them absorbed by the words that were beginning to reveal the story behind the artifacts. "May 29th, 1963, Sarah read aloud. "Today, I discovered something extraordinary in the forest. The box I found contains cylinders similar to the ones Daniel had mentioned. They seem to be very old, and the symbolism is of an unknown type. What's even more disturbing is the feeling that these objects have a specific purpose, perhaps a kind of communication or ritual. Hank frowned, trying to grasp the significance of the findings. This is consistent with what Dr. Allen suggested. It seems that these cylinders may be involved in some kind of ancient practice or technology. Sarah continued reading, moving on to the next diary entry. June 5th, 1963. I found more clues at the site where I found the cylinders. They seem to have a connection with an ancient cult or secret society. The symbols could represent a kind of language or instruction for something bigger. Cults and secret societies, Hank muttered. That's exactly the kind of thing that could explain the mystery surrounding Daniel's disappearance. The reading continued, revealing more details about the diary author's findings. He had found references to a group that believed in beings from another world and had developed a complex system of symbols to communicate with them. There were also mentions of experiments and rituals, which seemed to be aimed at opening a channel of communication with these entities. June 12, 1963. The group seems to be getting more and more agitated. The cylinders are apparently communication devices, and I have the impression that they are used to send or receive messages. Last night, I heard strange sounds in the forest, as if something was trying to communicate. I'm afraid of what it might mean. Sarah stopped reading for a moment and looked at Hank. These records indicate that Daniel was onto something much more complex and possibly dangerous than we imagined. He was investigating a form of communication with beings from another world, and it seems he was dealing with forces he didn't fully understand. Hank agreed. That could also explain the threatening messages we received. If Daniel was involved with something so dark, there may be other people or groups interested in keeping these secrets. They continued reading to the end of the diary. The last pages spoke of a growing fear and the author's desire to leave everything behind, fearing for his own life. There were mentions of a final ceremony scheduled for a specific location where the cylinders were expected to be used. June 20th, 1963. I can no longer continue with this research. I have the feeling that something is about to happen. Last night I saw strange figures in the forest and heard incomprehensible voices. If you find this, please burn everything and don't look for me anymore. The diary ended abruptly, leaving a sense of urgency and mystery in the air. Sarah closed the book and looked at Hank, who was clearly shaken by the reading. "This is deeper than we thought," said Hank with a grave expression. "Daniel was onto something much bigger and more dangerous. We need to find out where the final ceremony mentioned in the diary will take place and what happened to Daniel." Sarah picked up one of the cylinders and looked at it with an expression of determination. "We can use the information in the diary to try and find the location of the ceremony. If we can, maybe we can understand what happened and, who knows, find Daniel." As the night wind blew across the clearing and the shadows lengthened, Hank and Sarah knew they were approaching something significant. The diary had provided vital clues about what Daniel had found and what might be lurking, but it also brought new questions and a sense of urgency, indicating that the real danger was just beginning. They began to organize the notes and plan the next step. The final ceremony could be the key to understanding the whole mystery, and they were determined to uncover the truth, no matter what the cost. After the revelation contained in the diary, Hank and Sarah were more determined than ever to find out what had really happened to Daniel and what the nature of the cylinders was. The diary mentioned a final ceremony, but gave no specific details about the exact location. However, it did suggest that there was a map somewhere that could lead to that location. Back in Hank's apartment, they both revisited the map they had found in the metal box. Sarah spread the map out on the table and examined the symbols and annotations that had been made. "We need to see if there's any connection between the map and the diary," Sarah said, tracing her eyes over the markings. "The diary mentioned a specific location, but we don't have a clear description." Hank agreed. Let's compare the symbols on the map with the symbols on the cylinder. Maybe we can find a pattern or a place that stands out. The symbols on the cylinder and the map were complex and varied, but Hank and Sarah noticed that there was one particular symbol that appeared frequently. It seemed to be a geometric pattern that repeated itself at various points on the map. This symbol seems to be central to the map, Hank observed. It could be an important reference point. Sarah took a closer look and started measuring distances on the map. If we look at where this symbol appears, it's aligned with a mountainous area in the vicinity of the forest where we found the box. That could be our next clue, Hank concluded. Let's go to that mountainous area and look for anything that might be related to what we found in the diary. With a plan in mind, they prepared the necessary equipment and headed for the mountainous region indicated on the map. The path was steep and covered in dense vegetation, making progress slow and difficult. However, their determination kept them focused and moving forward. After several hours of walking, they reached a more open area where the vegetation seemed to have been disturbed recently. There were signs that something had been moved or hidden there. "Look at that," Sarah said, pointing to a group of stones arranged in a peculiar way. "That looks like some kind of structure, perhaps an ancient building or an altar." Hank approached and examined the stones. They were arranged in a pattern that seemed to correspond to one of the symbols on the map. In the center of the structure, there was an opening partially covered by debris. "It could be an entrance or a ritual site," Hank suggested. "Let's investigate further." Sarah and Hank cleared the opening, revealing a narrow entrance that led to a small, dark cave. With flashlights in hand, they carefully entered, on the lookout for any sign of danger. Inside the cave, they found more symbols carved into the walls, similar to those on the cylinder and the map. At the bottom of the cave, there was a raised platform with a series of cylinders and other ancient objects. Some of the cylinders were open, revealing a series of patterns and inscriptions that seemed to have a specific function. "This is incredible," Sarah said as she examined the objects. "These cylinders must be part of the same system as the previous ones. They could be related to the final ceremony mentioned in the diary." Hank approached the platform and found one cylinder in particular that was partially open. Inside, there was an ancient parchment that appeared to be a manual or instructions. Carefully, he unrolled the scroll and began to read. The text was complicated and used a language that mixed symbols with ancient words. There was a detailed description of a ritual that involved combining cylinders to create a communication channel. The ceremony mentioned in the diary seemed to be a point of convergence for all these elements. "This confirms that we're on the right track," Hank said with growing enthusiasm. "It seems that the final ceremony involves activating these cylinders in a specific ritual." As they examined more closely, they heard a noise coming from the cave entrance. Hank and Sarah looked at each other, alert for any threat. The sound was soft, but it seemed to be someone approaching. "Someone's here," Sarah whispered. "We need to hide and see who it is." They hid behind the rocks, keeping a close watch. The shadows moved at the entrance, and a figure appeared, illuminated by the torchlight. The figure was a man in a suit, the same one who had been watching them earlier. Hank and Sarah prepared to confront the intruder, but before they could act, the man approached the platform and began examining the cylinders. It seemed that he was looking for something specific. "This man is here for the same reason we are," Hank muttered. "But what is he looking for?" The presence of the man in the suit added a new layer of mystery and danger. They needed to be careful and strategic to avoid any confrontation and find out what was really going on. As they watched, the man in the suit picked up one of the cylinders and examined it closely. Hank and Sarah knew they were getting close to a complex and dangerous truth, and they were determined to find out what was really at stake. Hank and Sarah silently watched the figure of the man in the suit, who seemed to be carefully examining the cylinders on the platform. His meticulous behavior indicated that he was looking for something specific, but his presence added a layer of complexity to the mystery they were trying to unravel. "We need to find out what he's doing here unnoticed," Sarah whispered, looking closely at the man. If he's involved with what Daniel was researching, he could be the key to understanding all this. Hank nodded and began to move discreetly into a position that would allow them a better view of the intruder without revealing himself. Sarah did the same, moving carefully so as not to make a sound. The man in the suit picked up one cylinder in particular and opened it, revealing contents inside that appeared to be a series of notes and drawings. He consulted a small notebook he was carrying, making quick notes as he looked at the cylinder. "It looks like he's comparing the cylinders with something he has," Hank observed quietly. "Maybe he has some kind of guide or manual, similar to the diary we found." Sarah adjusted the light of her flashlight to get a clearer view, and saw that the man's notebook contained detailed diagrams of the cylinders and symbols. This seemed to confirm his connection with what Daniel had found. Suddenly, the man in the suit stood up and began to put away the cylinders he had removed as if he were preparing to leave. Hank and Sarah knew that this was the opportunity they needed to get more information about the intruder. "Let's follow him and see where he's going," said Hank. "We might be able to find out more about his intentions." They waited for the right moment, and when the man in the suit came out of the cave, followed him at a safe distance. The darkness of the night and the dense vegetation helped to conceal their presence, but the tension grew as they approached. The man in the suit walked along the hilly trail to a more open area where there was a vehicle parked, a dark, discreet SUV. He opened the trunk and began stowing the cylinders and notebook, looking like he was on a well-planned mission. Sarah made a quick analysis of the situation. "If we can get a closer look inside the vehicle, we might find more clues as to what he's planning." Hank agreed, and they quietly approached the SUV, keeping out of sight. Hank managed to open the driver's door, which was ajar, and they both looked inside. There were a number of documents, maps, and technical equipment scattered around, including a copy of the map they had found. "What's he doing with our map?" Sarah whispered, amazed. "It looks like he has an exact copy." Hank took a sheet from the nearest document and examined it. "This is an updated map of the area, with notes on the location of the cylinders. He must be looking for the same places we are." The man in the suit got into the vehicle and started the engine. Hank and Sarah quickly retreated so as not to be seen, and hid among the trees as the SUV began to pull away. They waited until the vehicle disappeared down the road before coming out of hiding. "Now we have to decide our next move," said Sarah, with a worried look on her face. "It looks like we're competing with someone who knows a lot about the cylinders and the symbols. We need to better understand what he's planning and how it relates to Daniel's disappearance." Hank nodded. "Let's go back to the cave and examine the cylinders and the documents we found. Maybe we can find some connection to what the man was looking for and how that might lead us to Daniel." With their plan set, Hank and Sarah returned to the cave. The presence of the man in the suit had added a new dimension to the mystery, and they needed to be prepared for what was to come. The competition and secrecy surrounding the cylinders were now clearer, and the search for answers was becoming even more urgent. As they examined the cylinders and the remaining notes, the feeling that they were on the verge of a great revelation grew. Whatever the man in the suit knew and whatever he was planning, they were determined to find out and solve the mystery surrounding Daniel's disappearance. The sun was just beginning to rise when Hank and Sarah returned to the cave. The night had been intense and full of new discoveries, and now was the time to reevaluate their findings and plan the next step. The encounter with the man in the suit had made it clear that they were dealing with something much more complex and dangerous than they had initially imagined. Upon re-entering the cave, Hank and Sarah revisited the cylinders and documents they had found. Sarah examined the symbols carved into the walls, while Hank focused on the notes and schematics that were scattered over the platform. "There's something I'm not getting," Sarah commented with a concentrated look. "The symbols seem to have a specific pattern, but we still can't decipher their purpose." Hank looked up from his notebook and observed the cylinders. "What we lack is a complete understanding of the ritual described in the diary. We need to find a way to interpret the symbols and perhaps understand how they fit into the context of what we're trying to solve. As they worked, the feeling that they were being watched returned. Hank raised his head and looked around, but saw no one. The atmosphere seemed calm, but tension was in the air. Suddenly, they heard the sound of approaching footsteps. The two of them quickly hid behind the rocks, prepared for anything. A new figure appeared at the entrance to the cave. It was a middle-aged woman with an expression of urgency and determination. She carried a backpack and seemed familiar with the area. Sarah whispered, "That woman. She seems to be looking for something." The woman entered the cave, heading straight for the platform where the cylinders were. She began to examine the artifacts carefully, taking notes and photos. Hank and Sarah decided it was best to confront her, as she seemed to be there for a purpose. When the woman turned to get something from her backpack, Hank and Sarah approached and found her. "Are you looking for something?" Hank asked, trying to keep his voice calm and friendly. The woman startled momentarily, but quickly regained her composure. You're who I was looking for," she replied, with an expression of relief. "My name is Laura, and I'm investigating the same phenomena as you." Sarah raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "How do you know what we're doing?" Laura explained that she was an independent researcher specializing in unexplained phenomena and had been contacted by an anonymous source with information about the cylinders and the ritual. Her research had led her to the same point as Hank and Sarah, and she was trying to understand the purpose of the cylinders and what was at stake. "I have knowledge about these ancient practices," Laura said, showing an old record book and a series of notes. "It seems that the ritual we're investigating is much more complex and dangerous than we imagined. The cylinders are just one part of a larger system." Hank and Sarah shared what they had found so far, and Laura quickly analyzed the information. She confirmed that the central symbol on the map was related to a specific location that corresponded to an ancient cult site. "If what you found is true, then the site of the final ceremony must be in a more hidden area, probably concealed by some kind of protection or ancient sorcery," Laura explained. "We need to combine our knowledge and resources to locate and understand what's really going on." Hank and Sarah were skeptical, but understood that an alliance could be beneficial, given the level of complexity of what they were facing. They agreed to join forces temporarily to follow the trail and decipher the mystery of the cylinders and the ritual. While Laura prepared her equipment and organized her notes, Hank and Sarah discussed strategies for finding the location of the final ceremony. With the addition of Laura to the group, their collective knowledge of the mystery increased, but it also brought new questions and possible risks. "Let's move on," Hank said, determined. "We need to solve this before it's too late." The presence of the man in the suit and the complexity of the symbols indicate that we're only scratching the surface. Laura agreed. "Let's use everything we have to find the location and understand the ritual. This may be our only chance of solving the mystery and, who knows, finding Daniel." With a new alliance formed and a plan in mind, Hank, Sarah, and Laura prepared for the next stage of the investigation. The search for the final ceremony and a complete understanding of the cylinders were getting closer and closer, and their collaboration promised to bring new discoveries and challenges. With Laura's collaboration, Hank and Sarah plunged into a new phase of the investigation. The team was now more equipped and focused, with Laura providing valuable insights into the ritual and the cylinders. Together, they set to work decoding the symbols and locating the possible site of the final ceremony. Laura had brought a number of ancient documents detailing ancient practices and rituals similar to those described in the diary and found in the caves. Her knowledge of the occult and ancient practices was vast, and this proved vital to understanding what they were up against. "The symbols we found are part of a very specific ritualistic set," Laura explained as she analyzed the cylinders. These rituals usually involve activating multiple elements to open a channel or portal, which can have various purposes, depending on the intention of the ritual. Hank and Sarah listened attentively as Laura continued to explain the possible implications of the ritual. It seems that the ritual can be used for various purposes, but it usually involves some kind of communication with external entities or unknown forces. External entities, Sarah repeated, feeling a chill. How does this relate to Daniel's disappearance? Laura flipped through her notes. If the ritual is involved with unknown entities or forces, that could explain Daniel's disappearance. He could have been lured into the ritual, or even worse, he could have been a specific target. Hank intervened. We need to locate the site of the final ceremony. If we find that location and understand how the ritual is to be carried out, perhaps we can find out what really happened to Daniel and how the cylinders fit into all this. Laura examined the map and began to plot a route based on the information they had. Based on the notes and the practices I know, the site of the ceremony must be at a specific point that aligns with the symbols we found. It's probably hidden somewhere remote, protected by some form of secrecy. The team prepared to leave in search of the indicated location. Laura led them into an area of dense forest, where the symbols and patterns seemed to line up with the terrain features. The search was exhausting, with the team navigating narrow trails and natural obstacles. After hours of exploration, they reached a point where the vegetation seemed to have been cleared recently, revealing a hidden opening between the rocks. Laura examined the entrance and confirmed that it was a possible entrance to a place of worship. Looks like we're on the right track, Laura said as she adjusted her flashlight. Let's investigate. Hank, Sarah, and Laura carefully entered the opening, finding themselves in an underground chamber. The chamber was decorated with symbols similar to those found on the cylinders, and there was a central platform with a circle of stones arranged in a specific pattern. In the center of the circle, look, Sarah pointed. There's a marking that seems to be the key to activating the ritual. Laura approached the marking and began to examine the details. This confirms that this is the site of the final ceremony. The marking seems to indicate the position of each cylinder and how they must be activated to complete the ritual. Hank looked around, feeling a growing sense of unease. If the ritual is really about communicating with outside forces, we need to be very careful. There could be side effects or unexpected consequences. Laura agreed. We need to proceed with caution. I'll check the rest of the chamber to make sure there are no traps or additional dangers. While Laura was investigating the chamber, Hank and Sarah found a set of additional cylinders, which seemed to have been left there as part of the ritual. Each cylinder was marked with symbols that matched those found earlier. Apparently, all the cylinders need to be present to activate the ritual, Sarah noted. We need to make sure everything is in place before proceeding. Laura returned and confirmed that the chamber was secure. We're ready to try to activate the ritual, but we need to make sure we fully understand what we're doing. With the cylinders arranged correctly and the symbols aligned, the team was about to perform the ritual and discover what was hidden. The tension was palpable, and the feeling that they were about to reveal something significant was undeniable. As they prepared for the next step, the reality of what they were about to face began to set in. The ritual, the cylinders and the symbols were about to reveal themselves completely, and Hank, Sarah, and Laura were determined to uncover the hidden truth behind Daniel's disappearance and the events that had triggered this complex investigation. The atmosphere in the underground chamber was charged with palpable tension. Hank, Sarah, and Laura were concentrating on the arrangement of the cylinders and the central marking that seemed to be crucial to the ritual. The silence was interrupted only by the sound of their breathing and the occasional echo of water droplets falling from the ceiling of the chamber. Laura positioned the last cylinder in the indicated place, and the three of them stood back to observe the arrangement. Everything is ready, Laura said. adjusting the flashlight to illuminate the symbols around the platform. Now we need to follow the process exactly as described in the notes. One mistake could have unforeseen consequences. Hank and Sarah watched as Laura began to recite a series of words in an ancient language based on the inscriptions and records found. The ritual involved chanting a formula which, according to what they had learned, would activate the cylinders and potentially reveal crucial information. Sarah nervously whispered to Hank, "Do you think this is really going to work? What if the intention of the ritual is something we can't control?" Hank gave her a reassuring look. "We need to try. We don't know what will happen if we don't do it. If the ritual was really meant to communicate with something, maybe it will help us understand what happened to Daniel." Laura finished reciting the formula and began to move the cylinders as instructed. As the cylinders were adjusted and turned, the symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, reflecting a faint light that illuminated the chamber in an eerie way. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, observing the growing glow. "It looks like the cylinders are aligning with the symbols," Laura explained. "The glow indicates that the ritual is being activated as planned." However, the atmosphere in the chamber began to change. The temperature dropped abruptly, and a feeling of unease gripped the group. The shadows on the walls seemed to move uneasily, and a subtle, almost imperceptible sound began to fill the space, a low hum, as if something was approaching. Suddenly, a beam of light emerged from the center of the platform, casting an intense glow that enveloped the chamber. Hank and Sarah shielded themselves from the blinding rays, while Laura tried to keep control of the situation. The beam of light began to form complex patterns in the air, and the images that emerged seemed to reveal a series of enigmatic scenes and symbols. "Look!" Laura exclaimed, pointing to the images that were forming. These images, they seemed to represent something to do with the ritual and the cylinders. Among the images, there was a scene that seemed to show an unknown being engaged in an ancient practice. The sight was disturbing, and the feeling that something was about to manifest intensified. "This isn't right," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "This seems to be going beyond what we expected." Laura tried to concentrate on the images and recited a series of additional instructions to try to keep the ritual under control. However, the brightness and sound continued to increase, and the feeling that they were about to face something unknown grew stronger and stronger. The beam of light began to pulsate, and the patterns intensified, revealing a figure in the center of the glow. The figure looked like an indistinct silhouette, floating and changing shape. The presence was imposing and filled with an energy that defied comprehension. "What is it?" Hank asked, with fear reflected in his eyes. Laura, with an expression of determination mixed with apprehension, replied, "This could be a manifestation of the entities or forces mentioned in the notes. If that's what I think it is, we need to end the ritual quickly to avoid any unwanted results." With that, Laura began to recite a closing formula, trying to interrupt the ritual and dissipate the energy that was being channeled. The chamber was now filled with a frenetic energy, and the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Gradually, the beam of light began to weaken and the images disappeared. The temperature in the chamber began to return to normal, and the feeling of discomfort subsided. The brightness of the cylinders and the symbols on the wall also diminished until everything returned to its original state. Laura, panting, leaned on the platform. "That was more intense than I expected. The ritual was partially completed, but not with the expected result. The presence we felt may indicate that something else is involved." Hank and Sarah looked around, trying to process what they had witnessed. "So what do we do now?" Sarah asked. Laura took a deep breath and replied, "We need to review everything we've learned and what we've seen. There's something else going on here, and we need to find out exactly what it is before we try anything else." The team was exhausted but determined. The ritual had revealed new dimensions to the mystery and shown that the situation was even more complex and dangerous than they had imagined. With the revelation of the figure in the center of the glow and the disturbing energy they felt, the next stage of the investigation became even more critical. With the chamber once again silent, Hank, Sarah, and Laura prepared themselves to face what was to come, aware that the search for the truth was far from over. After the intense episode in the underground chamber, Hank, Sarah, and Laura returned to the makeshift camp they had set up at the entrance to the cave. The experience had left them exhausted and restless. The intense glow and the enigmatic presence they had encountered during the ritual were enough to shake their confidence and increase their sense of urgency. Sitting around a fire, they reviewed the events of the chamber. Laura leafed through her notes while Hank and Sarah looked on, trying to process the information and find a new direction for the investigation. "We need to understand what we saw in the chamber," Laura said, with a serious tone. "The figure that appeared in the beam of light could be related to what's behind the cylinders and the ritual." Sarah, who was visibly upset, added, "But what exactly was that figure? And why did the ritual activate such an intense presence?" Laura analyzed the images that had been projected. "The records I've studied talk about entities or forces that can manifest when a ritual is activated, especially if there are hidden or unknown intentions behind it. It could be that the ritual was used to call forth something specific." Hank, with a determined look on his face, said, "If the ritual really is to communicate or invoke something, we need to find out more about what exactly is being called forth. If it's related to Daniel's disappearance, we need to find the answer as soon as possible." Laura agreed. The next step should be to review the inscriptions in the chamber and combine this information with the old records I brought back. Perhaps we can find a clue that will lead us to a clearer answer. The next morning, the team returned to the chamber with the research materials and began working on the inscriptions. Laura drew the marks and symbols on paper to compare with the notes. Hank and Sarah assisted, looking for patterns and connections. As they analyzed the symbols, Sarah found a detail they hadn't noticed before. "These symbols seem to form a kind of map," she observed. "If we look at them that way, we might be able to pinpoint a specific point." Laura examined what Sarah had found. "This could be related to the site of the final ceremony. If we can locate that point on the map, it might give us an idea of where to look for the next clue." The team traced the map based on the symbols and identified an area in the vicinity of the cave that seemed to match the markings. It was a dense area of forest that had been overlooked in the previous search. "Let's check this area out," Hank decided. "It could be that the answer lies there." Armed with new information and a new direction, Hank, Sarah, and Laura set out to explore the area indicated. The forest was impenetrable and the path was difficult to follow. However, the team's determination kept them going. After a long journey through the thick vegetation, they found a hidden opening between the trees. The opening seemed to be an entrance to a small cave or underground space. The team advanced cautiously, knowing that any further discoveries could change the course of the investigation. Inside the opening, they found a chamber similar to the previous one, but smaller. The chamber was full of traces of ancient practices and seemed to have been used for minor rituals. In the center, there was a pedestal with an object covered in a cloth. Laura carefully removed the cloth, revealing an ancient book of records and a set of small cylinders similar to those found in the main cave. The book was full of inscriptions and detailed illustrations, many of which aligned with what they had seen earlier. "This is incredible," Laura said in amazement. "These cylinders and the book seem to confirm that we're on the right track. The book may contain additional information about the ritual and what's really going on." Hank and Sarah approached and helped examine the book. The pages were full of details about the rituals and symbols, and one particular section seemed to describe the final ceremony and the intentions behind it. "What's written here could explain the forces we felt and the figure that appeared in the ritual," Laura commented as she studied one page in particular. "It seems that the ritual is a way of connecting with an ancient entity, a force that may be seeking something or trying to manifest itself in some way. Hank, Sarah, and Laura were now closer to understanding the true nature of the ritual and the forces involved. The book and the cylinders found in the small cave provided new clues and details that could lead to the solution of the mystery. As the sun began to set, the team was determined to continue the investigation. With the new information in hand and renewed determination, they were ready to face the next challenges and eventually discover the truth about Daniel's disappearance and the enigma of the cylinders. With the logbook in hand, Hank, Sarah, and Laura returned to the camp to analyze the information discovered in the secondary cave. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and tension, knowing that they were about to unravel the truth about Daniel's disappearance and the mystery of the cylinders. Sitting around the campfire, the team began to review the contents of the book. The pages were full of details about ancient rituals and the forces that could be invoked. Laura focused on a section that seemed to describe a closing ceremony, something that could explain how to end the ritual and avoid further consequences. It seems that the book offers a way to undo or control the connection with the entity, Laura explained. If the ritual has been partially completed, there is still a way to intervene and perhaps even restore what has been altered. Hank and Sarah watched as Laura prepared a formula based on the instructions in the book. The ceremony described seemed to be a complex process, but it also offered hope of reversing the effects of the ritual. If we can perform this ceremony correctly, we can perhaps find a solution to what happened to Daniel and close the portal that was opened, Laura said, with a tone of determination. The team headed back to the main cave, where they had found the first group of cylinders and performed the ritual. They prepared the site for the closing ceremony, following the instructions in the book. Hank adjusted the cylinders and symbols, while Sarah prepared the additional components needed. The atmosphere in the cave was once again charged with a sense of expectation, but this time there was a growing hope that the ceremony might bring a resolution to the mystery. Laura began to recite the closing formula as described in the book. The ceremony involved chanting specific words and activating the cylinders in an exact order. As Laura spoke, the energy in the cave began to change. The glow from the cylinders began to intensify again, but this time with a softer, more stabilized light. The feeling of unease and tension that had filled the cave earlier began to subside. The glow formed more harmonious and peaceful patterns, indicating that the ritual was being brought to a proper close. "We're almost there," Laura said, as she continued to recite the formula. "The ceremony is working. We need to stay focused and complete the process." After a series of intonations and final adjustments, the glow from the cylinders finally began to fade. The cave returned to its normal state, and the feeling that something was being contained dissipated. Laura completed the ceremony with a final gesture and a sigh of relief. "It seems that the ritual has been successfully concluded," Laura said, looking at the cylinders that were now extinguished. "The portal has been closed, and the connection with the entity has been broken." Hank and Sarah felt a weight being lifted from their shoulders. The cave, now quiet and silent, seemed to confirm that the problem had been solved. "What about Daniel?" Sarah asked. "Have we managed to find any clues as to what happened to him?" Laura looked at the notes and records. "Unfortunately, there's no specific information about his fate. But with the ritual over, we hope that any negative influence has been removed. The search for Daniel may have to continue in another way." The team decided it was time to end the investigation and return home. The experience had been stressful and challenging, but also revealing. They had faced unknown dangers and unraveled a complex mystery, and now they were at peace knowing that they had done their best to resolve the situation. As the team prepared to leave the cave, a sense of closure and accomplishment enveloped them. The investigation into Daniel's disappearance and the cylinders had revealed many truths, and the closing ceremony brought a long-awaited resolution, although not all the answers had been found. With the cave now silent and the feeling that the threat had been neutralized, Hank, Sarah, and Laura left, ready to face the future with a new perspective and a deep respect for the unknown forces they had encountered.